So my name is Estelle Zinstag, and I'll be your chair for today's webinar. I'm an associate professor of criminology at Edinburgh Napier University, and most of my research revolves around restorative justice. It is with great pleasure that so Steve Kirkwood, who is a senior lecturer at Edinburgh University and head of social work there, and Jenny Johnston, who's a senior lecturer in law at Newcastle University, and I, in the name of the Scottish Network of Restorative Justice Researchers, welcome you today for this webinar entitled Trauma and Restorative Justice, Discussing International Research Practices and Exploring the Future for Scotland. This is the seventh in a series of international seminars and webinars that we have been organizing. The first one was on intersections between the arts and RJ in 2019. The second on education and RJ, the third one on RJ and courts. The fourth one was on policing and restorative justice. The fifth one on children's rights and restorative justice. And last year was on RJ and serious crimes. Some of the recordings of previous ones are available on the website of RJ Forum Scotland, and we'll provide the link in the chat in a moment. Some of these seminars and webinars have been organised due to the topics in the past in collaboration with others, like the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, the Scottish Institute of Policing Research, and the Children and Young People's Centre for Justice. What is the Scottish Network of Restorative Justice Researchers? So Steve, Jenny, and I are the founders and co-chairs of this network, created already in 2018. We're all academics, and but also members of RJ Forum Scotland, an interagency forum working towards the development of restorative justice here in Scotland. RJ has been developing here with, in particular, the Scottish Government's guidance note, which was published in 2017. In the guidance note, the Scottish Government has defined RJ as follows. RJ is a process of independent, facilitated contact, which supports constructive dialogue between a victim and a person who has harmed, whether this be an adult, a child, a young person, or a representative of a corporate or other body arising from an offence or alleged offence. Following the guidance, there was an action plan launched on restorative justice in 2019 by Humza Yousaf, who was Cabinet Secretary for Justice at the time, and then subsequently became our First Minister for some years. Basically, this action plan basically committing to make RJ available to everyone in Scotland in the coming years. With all these quite exciting developments, we feel it is important to make sure that research follows and supports the developments in practice and policy, as we firmly believe that one can't go without the other. As network, we have committed ourselves to keep abreast of these developments, to evaluate and publish on these developments, as well as to inform and share our knowledge, to organize events to support the development of restorative justice, as well as explore new and original avenues for that, to explore how it is done elsewhere and how it could be work here. With that in mind, we started organizing this event today and will continue to organize such events in future. If you have particular topics you think would be useful to hear about from international experts, which can help the developments of RJ in Scotland, please do get in touch with us. Also, if you would like to join the network, please just drop us an email. The idea for this particular seminar originates from the fact that it is clear from research and practice that trauma, harm, and crime are deeply intertwined. And in order to develop an adequate and successful RJ practice, it is crucial to understand what trauma means, and how it impacts persons harmed, but also persons responsible for harm and their communities, and what is needed to respond to and address this aspect appropriately. In Scotland and internationally, there is a growing recognition that trauma impacts on people who engage with justice services, whether because they are responsible for offending behaviour, harmed by crime, or both, and therefore those working in the justice sector need to practice in ways that are informed by an understanding of trauma. We're extremely grateful to our invited speakers, both experts in this field. First, Kirsty Pate, Programme Lead at the Trauma Responsive Social Work Services at Scottish Government, and second, Claudia Kristen Schneider, President of the Swiss Restorative Justice Forum and a board member of the European Forum for Restorative Justice, but also the author of the recently published Trauma-Informed Restorative Dialogues, The Power of Community, which was published by Routledge. Both we're very grateful you have accepted to join us this afternoon, and Steve for offering to respond to them. Our two main speakers will have a maximum of 30 minutes each to present their contribution, and if necessary, I will interrupt them shortly to make them aware that they have 5 minutes left. Steve will then reply for about 10 minutes, and then we should have about 30 minutes, a good 30 minutes for questions and a discussion. If you have questions, you may write them already in the chat. Jenny and I will monitor the chat and will then pass on your questions to the speakers, who will take the time to address as many as possible in the general session at the end. We will have to mute you all for obvious reasons, but you are more than welcome to leave your cameras on during the discussion. And also just reminding those who have just arrived that the webinar is being recorded. We've indeed have quite a few that have apologized, can't join, but would like to hear the webinar. So I'm delighted to welcome Kirsty Pate from Scottish Government, whose summary bio you can find in the flyer that was sent to you along with the link to the webinar yesterday. Her intervention is entitled Trauma Responsive Organisations, Systems and Workforces in Scotland. Kirsty, you have the floor.
Thank you, Estelle. Thanks for inviting me to participate today. Excuse me. I'll just take a wee moment to pull up some slides before we get started. It's nice to see a couple of familiar and friendly faces in the audience, as well as many new ones. Okay, can you let me know if this is currently sharing on presenter mode?
Yeah, it is.
Thank you. Just to say, the way that my screens are set up today, I can't actually see anybody. I don't have that lovely little option of 2 or 3 faces down the side. So if there's any issues with my slides, I can't see anybody. So please feel free just to interrupt me. No please do that, because I'll be looking at slides for the next 30 minutes. Thank you. I'm going to speak about the work that's been taking place in Scotland in recent years to develop trauma-informed and responsive organisations, systems and workforces, and I'll offer some reflections on its application in social work and a justice practice context, before we hear from Claudia specifically in relation to restorative justice. I won't talk about trauma experiences in detail today or share any personal experiences or ask you to, in order that we'll all contribute to a safe and supportive session for the next couple of hours. So many of you will be aware that the Scottish Government and COSLA have a joint ambition for trauma-informed and responsive services and workforces across Scotland, and that's with the view that this can improve access to services, reduce barriers and improve outcomes for people who use our services, and also support the well-being of those who work within them. And the National Trauma Training Programme was established in 2018, and it's featured in numerous consecutive programmes for government, and it demonstrates a kind of long-term commitment and the investment that the government have made. In 2023, this was rebranded as the National Trauma Transformation Programme to reflect the need for a whole system approach to trauma-informed culture, policies and practice across the workforce that requires long-term transformational change. And we've now got around 70 national and local organisations across Scotland that have signed up to be trauma-informed organisations that have made a leadership pledge publicly. So these include COSLA, Police Scotland, Health Improvement Scotland and the Association of Directors of Education of Scotland. They've all signed up and publicly committed to work with others to put trauma-informed and trauma-responsive practice in place across our workforce and our services. We can see the Scottish Government and COSLA's vision and commitment across a very wide range of policy documents, including those with direct impact on social work, social care and the health workforce, and it includes our national strategy for community justice. The National Trauma Transformation Programme in Scotland provides a wide infrastructure supporting implementation, starting with 3 delivery trials since 2019 to test out a range of different approaches of how we implement high quality and sustainable trauma training with implementation support across lots of different contexts and different sectors. Some targeted work has taken place in a number of priority sectors, as well as universal developments and universal resources being made available across Scotland. This has included piloting trauma-informed system change across 4 pilot sites for social work, including within Justice Social Work in Scotland. There's also been a specific focus on supporting change for victims and witnesses in our justice system, and that's included the development and the delivery of bespoke training for all 230 members of Scotland's judiciary. To support the vision into reality, funding's been invested since 2018 through our health boards, through local authorities, through NHS Education for Scotland, the Improvement Service and the Resilience Learning Partnership, as well as investment in trauma-responsive social work services. There's a full range of resources to support organisations in planning and developing trauma-informed approaches. NHS Education for Scotland produced the first psychological trauma knowledge and skills framework. You can see that here on the screen. That was produced in 2017. This outlines what any person in any job in any organisation needs to know and be able to do to respond appropriately to someone who has experienced trauma and who may be impacted.
Kirsty, can I interrupt you for a second? Your slides are not moving, so because we're still on the first slide.
Thank you for interrupting me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's really helpful. What can I do to help with that? Thank you for that. This did come up in our retest, didn't it? Let me just try one more thing. So you won't have seen all my delightful images of our...
Now it's moved, so
is that moving now, but that's not in slideshow?
Now we're on the second slide, yeah.
But you're not seeing that in slideshow mode?
It is in slideshow mode as far as I can see.
Okay, so you're not seeing lots of notes and lots of other things on Teams?
No,
okay.
No, we're seeing only your slide.
Thank you for that. Thank you. I'll carry on now. That's really helpful. So I'm just going to whiz by. These are the slides that I've been speaking to, and obviously we can get this sent out to people afterwards as well. Okay. You'll see here on this slide the Scottish Psychological Trauma Training Plan, which is intended to support managers and organisations to work out how to turn knowledge and skills framework into reality. So how do they identify or develop trauma training, and how do they embed skills into practice of the workforce while supporting the well-being of the workforce also? There's a whole range of free training resources and learning materials that are available. The National Trauma Transformation Programme provides something for everyone in different areas and different fields and different sectors of the workforce across Scotland. And this is simply an example of the way in which the programme aims to support a message that's key, that trauma is everyone's business. Some of you may be familiar with some of the online freely available trauma skilled e-learning modules, for example, that are on this slide here. And there's also specific resources that have been developed, including multiple video clips, resources and companion documents, all of which support leaders to think about their role in supporting trauma-informed system change. I thought it might be helpful to let people know some of the messages that we're hearing and sharing across the country. In recent years, the use of language associated with psychological trauma has become commonly adopted day to day, perhaps incorporated in ways that have become so common they may be unhelpful and sadly misappropriated. And language matters to help us be clear about the distinctions relating to psychological trauma and how traumatic stress differs from other types of stress. In our work with social work, we're speaking with leaders and the workforce about the range of stress that people experience, and we're encouraging thoughtful language and lots of reflection. All types of stress are important, and we will encounter people with a range of stress responses in social work and in the justice system. Not all adversity or distress leads to an event experienced as psychological trauma, and it's important to ensure a shared understanding and an ability to distinguish between stress, distress, and traumatic stress in our work. Understanding these helps us respond with greater confidence and greater care. So the Scottish Government invested within the Trauma Responsive Social Work Services programme, and currently we have worked with national and local partners to develop a whole range of different approaches and supports to develop this nationally across Scotland. It includes working with 3 of our social work universities. We've worked to support newly qualified social workers across the country, and we're working with around about 600 social work and multidisciplinary colleagues in 4 pilot sites, including adult services, adult mental health, justice and children's services. And the reflections from what we're hearing day to day from the front line are present in this input today, and I thought it was really helpful and important to bring frontline social work practice to the fore at this kind of conversation. One of the things that's been really key in our discussions across the country is thinking about language and definitions. The National Trauma Transformation Programme adopts this definition of psychological trauma from SAMHSA. An event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that's experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and has long-lasting effects on the individual's functioning. I know that lots of people will experience an event, a trauma, and have reactions that persist only in the short term. Others develop long-lasting reactions and subsequent effects, and often this is when someone experiences exposure to something extremely threatening or horrific events, often repeated, prolonged, from which it's impossible to escape, experienced as life-threatening, or where the individual's physical integrity is overwhelmed. And this can often include interpersonal or developmental trauma, such as childhood sexual abuse, repeated physical abuse, or domestic abuse. We know that people who have experienced multiple trauma are overrepresented in many services, including justice services. And often people we are seeking to support have experienced multiple traumas in childhood and into adulthood. And there's a growing recognition that when harms are experienced by individuals as psychological trauma, and people experience other disadvantage and harms such as poverty or homelessness, it places us at much greater risk of other additional harms. We're often working with people on the margins of their communities, unable to access the necessary support networks and capital that's required for an equal and a good life. So in social work and in justice services, we're engaging with psychological trauma in the context of structural inequalities, intergenerational poverty, issues of class and culture, and significant power imbalances and discrimination, including those experienced by women and girls and experienced by Black, minority, ethnic people and communities. We also know that our workforce in health, social care and social work has a higher prevalence of trauma experiences themselves than in the general population. Can I check if my slides are still on the screen? I'm having a bit of technical difficulties.
They just popped off there.
No,
I'm really sorry. I don't know what's going on. Apologies, folks. Okay. I thought it was helpful for us to think about, before we think about systems, the impacts, the many ways in which trauma can impact. So we know that impacts can be felt in the short term, and it's common to experience some reactions, acute reactions, over a 4 to 6 week period and not experience long-lasting effects. One of the key messages we're talking with people about across the country is really that often people recover from psychological trauma without the need for any professional support, and that others can experience longer term impacts and equally go on to live fulfilling lives. Ourselves, colleagues, people that we support in the justice system will all have developed a whole range of survival skills, strengths, and different ways of coping in the aftermath of psychological trauma. We know that people's experiences can be unique, but one of the key aspects of our programme of work is that there are common reactions experienced by many, and we're very keen that our workforce understand those with depth. It's helpful for us to understand these when we're thinking about systems and practices that aim to respond without doing further additional harm. So we're talking to social workers and social work leaders, support workers and family support workers, nurses and psychologists across our systems about the types of reactions that are fairly common within the people that we are supporting and within our workforce. So when our individual systems, our bodies become overwhelmed at the point of trauma and memories may not have been processed or filed away, and often leave people reacting here in the present when there is no threat or danger, as their body would respond at the point of trauma when there was serious threat and danger. Ongoing persistent perceptions of current threat can remain, and intrusive memories return unexpectedly, with a range of physiological sensations similar to those experienced at the time of the trauma event. Re-experiencing the trauma event here in the present, and therefore understandably avoiding thoughts or memories of the events, avoiding activities, situations or people, and relationships, including professional relationships that become reminiscent of the events themselves. And what we're hearing from our workforce, that having a real clarity in this language and the definitions and describing the reactions is new and additional in relation to how they go on to practice. For individuals who experience persistent trauma over time, often relational and developmental trauma, often within the context of our caregivers, people will report having chronic difficulties with regulating emotions and tolerating distress. We'll be working with people who report persistent problems feeling close to others, being able to develop and maintain safe and trusting relationships, including those with professionals and services, and significant impacts relating to the negative views of oneself, often with deep and pervasive feelings of shame. So in order to design trauma-informed and responsive systems, it's important to be aware of the very wide range of ways that we know that trauma commonly impacts on people, including increased risks of mental health, physical health, and wider social impacts. And really importantly, for the work that we're doing in justice, highlighting the many ways that people cope with post-traumatic and complex post-traumatic reactions, ways to get by, ways to survive having survived the trauma. So here we start to see the accumulative effects that some survivors of trauma might experience over time. And many of you will see this within your practice day to day and also within your research work. I've included an illustration here. Some of you may be familiar with it, and I did this because in the sort of roots of this image we see trauma and adversity, and then in the trunk we see the kind of impacts that we've just talked through here together. But also in the leaves, this visual helps us to think about the increased risks of poorer outcomes for people who are affected long-term by psychological trauma. And the reason I just wanted to kind of highlight it today is because this is largely associated with systemic reviews and meta-analysis in relation to how trauma-informed systems approaches can mitigate long-term risks. So let's see if the technology works for me here. This is just an example, and we'll send this out to people, but you can see here when we think about the leaves, these kind of longer-term outcomes, we'll see an example pop up here that tells us that 91% of women in Scottish prisons have experienced both childhood and adulthood trauma, and in this particular study there was a real focus on the current impacts for those women. What this also allows us to do is to look at some of the research sitting behind this. If we take a trauma-informed approach across a whole juvenile justice system, we start to see reductions in misconduct incidents, reductions in assaults, reductions in isolation and confinement, and improvements in people's experiences of safety. And I wanted to bring this today to get us to have a real think about the evidence base, because trauma-informed systems change is a relatively new area of research. It's been growing over the last 4 decades internationally. And the Scottish Government undertook a review of the evidence base and published this document. And we know that there are limitations in what we understand about trauma-informed and trauma-responsive systems. And we need to continue to ask questions, to be curious, and to add to the existing research through evaluation of our work. However, what we do know through this analysis is that we can demonstrate considerable improvements for children, improvements for young people, for adults, families and caregivers, as well as the staff working within our services when we adopt trauma-informed system-wide change. So what do these systems look like? At the heart of this diagram, we see the trauma principles as they were developed here in Scotland. Systems, relationships and practices that offer choice, collaboration, trust, safety and empowerment. And this will be familiar to many of you. Our systems need to take account of these principles and across practice, as well as where give appropriate attention to gender, historical and cultural issues also. The diagram helps describe to us organisations where everyone is supported to realise how common the experience of trauma is. And we've really just started to understand this over the last few decades. But also where people working across the whole system can recognise the different ways that trauma affects people in the system, including the workforce, and respond by adapting to reduce barriers and engage in ways that recognise people's individual resilience. Systems and services that are proactively looking out for opportunities to resist re-traumatisation and who are adopting the principles through relationships. Relationships-based practice is really important and it's not enough. People may be familiar with the roadmap for creating trauma-informed and responsive change. This guidance provides an overview of why trauma-informed and responsive organisations, systems and workforces matter. It also provides a self-assessment checklist and lots of activities that support the most effective ways to begin and progress a journey towards being a trauma-informed and responsive organisation. And the roadmap highlights 9 drivers, 9 areas of focus for our attention and activity to design and develop the improvements that are needed. I won't go into all of this in detail here, but rather highlight the whole system-wide approach that's necessary to ensure safe and effective approaches that require attention to organisational culture, attention to leadership, an enhanced focus on workforce wellbeing, and specifically additional training for our workforce dependent on their role and their remit. This slide reflects information that's contained in the Psychological Trauma Knowledge and Skills Framework for the Scottish workforce, and some of you may be familiar with this. It highlights an important key message that we don't all need to be experts in trauma, that different knowledge and skills are required depending on our role and our work remit. We all have something to contribute along the way. Excuse me. And here, this just provides some examples of the types of job roles and people who work across our systems. And if we think about this within a justice context, looking at the informed level, thinking about our administration staff, at the skilled level, thinking about our business staff, our reception staff and our HR workforce. And our work across social work services in Scotland and our pilots, we're working extensively across the trauma-informed, skilled and enhanced practice levels to make sure that everybody is supported to do their best to respond in ways that will not cause further harm. So considerations across justice systems in particular, thinking about a justice context and setting. What does our leadership and our culture need to look like? What changes do we need to make at a trauma-skilled level to make sure that leadership and culture supports the workforce to practice and ensures a system within which they can deliver best outcomes? This will require proactive, focus on well-being of the workforce, as well as extensive reactive measures. So for people who we know what they do day in, day out within justice, we know what they hear and what they experience, making sure that we look after those people within our system, making sure that we develop the right policies and the right processes that reduce barriers and that can increase access so that people can engage with the support and interventions that are offered and provided by justice practitioners. This includes making sure that we can have a system where people access suitable quality training, including the enhanced practice type, that will provide highly trained and skilled workforce that are fully equipped to ensure that when we are working with individuals across our system, they're all fully aware of the risks of harm associated with our processes, the risks of triggering, the risks of re-experiencing, and the potential for re-traumatizing and causing new and additional psychological harms. This needs to be fully understood. And a workforce equipped to provide evidence-based enhanced interventions where it's suitable in the role to do so. And that will require adequate and suitable coaching and supervision, and a system that's supported by trauma and mental health specialists with adequate governance. Thinking about the principles in justice practice, conscious of my time, we spoke earlier about some of the common impacts of psychological trauma. And when our systems and practice is trauma responsive, we take time to think about how some of those harms will show up in the room with us. How will this show up in the room with practitioners? What might we see and what might we experience in the room with someone who's perhaps hyper-aroused and therefore hyper-vigilant? For someone who's particularly avoidant, how might that impact on their engagement and work with professionals and services? And whose presentation is likely to be impacted by a range of different understandable coping strategies, whether that's self-injury or substance use. How might we collaborate with them? How might we create trust and how might we create safety? Not only in the context of their previous experiences, but the current impacts that we will feel and that they will bring into the room and the relationship with us. So this is an opportunity to offer a new type of relationship, different and distinct from that which they experienced in prior interpersonal experiences of abuse or ongoing abusive relationships. It involves being explicit about the likelihood of trauma impacts currently, common and known impacts being discussed with the people that we're supporting, and providing psychoeducation and normalising, reducing experiences of shame. Working in ways in justice that reduce the risks of re-experiencing and causing those additional new psychological harms as part of our work. So collaborating with people to support safety and stabilisation. All of this requires a workforce that's equipped to undertake complex assessment and be able to formulate appropriately the right interventions and take account of the current risks to everybody involved in light of their presenting difficulties. So justice practice that requires trauma specialists and mental health professionals to support the system of work. I'm just going to summarise and conclude. In Scotland, we're fairly well placed now to make our restorative justice systems and processes trauma-informed and responsive at the informed and skilled level. We've been gaining the momentum that allows us to apply general approaches to trauma-informed systems and organisations in a restorative justice context. Some of the challenges still remain in terms of access to training aligned with the research, and this is mostly available generally within social work, within trauma and mental health services. So some of the challenges that we're hearing about across the system that don't specifically relate to restorative justice remain the lack of access to training. Also, what we're hearing is about gaps in the provision of high quality supervision of trauma enhanced practice. Some of the challenges recognising where we are now and where we want to get to. Capacity to practice at trauma enhanced level in our workforces is growing, but it's growing slowly. And we're working towards our relevant workforces being fully equipped to deliver safe and effective practice. So we're on a journey, and we need to continue to draw on the expertise of trauma specialists to help to continue to build our capacity across systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. Sorry about all the technical
It's
issues.
absolutely at my end, I'm sure of it.
Thank you so much. Claudia, so Dr. Claudia Kristin Schneider, who is from the Swiss RJ Forum and the European Forum for Restorative Justice, and you'll find her short bio in the flyer as well, will now take the floor and we'll talk about trauma-informed approaches in restorative justice practices. So Claudia, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Estelle. And thank you very much for this opportunity to share about trauma-informed restorative justice practice. I hope my slides come up.
Yep, there.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. So thank you so much for joining. I can't see anyone, so sorry. I have maybe the same problem as you had before, Kirsty. Is there a chance that I can change the view?
The view is fine for us now.
It's fine for you. I can't see anyone, but okay.
I'll talk to you if there's any issues. But
okay, excellent. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really a privilege to be here and to share. And thank you so much, Kirsty, for your introduction, which is so helpful for the second part on trauma-informed restorative justice. As some of you may not be very familiar with restorative justice, we agreed I would enter very briefly with definitions on restorative justice and what it means in practice. So what you see here are the Scottish definition and as well the Council of Europe definition on restorative justice. And in both definitions, we see that it is a process that is built on a constructive dialogue that includes the person that has been harmed or multiple persons and the people who have caused the harm. And what is very interesting as well in the restorative, in the recommendation of the Council of Europe, it clearly explains that it's any process which enables these parties to enter when they freely consent and participate actively into a form of dialogue. So it's not just one process, but it's many different possibilities. We see in both definitions that they center on dialogue. That's the aim of the process, that the people who have been involved in a crime as a victim, as an offender, or the person harmed and the person harming, that they have this chance to enter into dialogue, to address the harm they have experienced, to address the harm that has been caused. And what we see is in the criminal justice system, it can be so painful, especially for victims, when they realize that they don't really have a space, they don't really have a voice, and they feel that their experiences, their pain, the impact that the crime has had on their lives is not really heard, that their experience is not being validated. So the aim in restorative justice is to create that safe space where they can have that voice, where they can ask questions, where they can confront the person who has caused the harm with the impact it has had on their lives, maybe on the lives of their loved ones, and to enter really into that dialogue where they can express things, but as well hear from the other person why it has happened to them, how it came so far that this person has committed this crime. The important thing is that the process really is co-constructed with the parties and is adapted to their needs. So when someone gets in touch with a restorative service, it's important to see what are these persons' needs, what's the context, what's the situation, how is it possible to co-construct with them a process that makes sense, that addresses their needs, their situation, the possibilities that are provided within that context, the risks as well. And so we cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach, but we need to really see what each person that comes, with all the parties that come, what's the context and how can we address it so it makes sense, that they can enter into a process that's meaningful to them. So it may be that they decide to really meet face to face in the same room and address what needs to be addressed. It can be that they say, okay, that's too much for us. We would like to exchange messages in one way or another, which can be through the facilitators. It can take the form of letters, of audio or video messages. Or it's as well possible that they may say, okay, I do need to see the other person. I need to see the face, for example, of the person who has harmed me, and what happens in their face when I share my story, when I share the impact. But I could never be in the same room with that person. There might be as well a fear that if they meet in the same place, that this person could follow them afterwards. So nowadays, with tools like Zoom or Teams, we have this possibility as well, and it can be very helpful. So that's the background of what I'll be talking about: restorative justice, any form of process that enables the persons harmed and the persons who have caused the harm, and maybe their support persons or family members, to enter into a dialogue that makes sense for them, that's safe for them, that's meaningful to them. So my presentation will center on the intersection between restorative justice and trauma-informed practice. I often hear from people saying, but restorative justice is always trauma-informed, because the values may be similar and because both are relational approaches. This may seem like this. And yet, as we have heard from Kirsty's presentation, trauma-informed practice means that we have knowledge about trauma, the impact it has on individuals, how it impacts their brains, their bodies, their behavior, their relationships, their view of themselves and others, how they perceive the world, their worldview, that they may not feel safe anymore. And so there cannot be any trauma-informed practice without specific training. And Kirsty has presented how in Scotland much emphasis is put on training people as well, depending on where they work, what they do. There are different levels. But to be trauma-informed, we need to be specifically trained. So what we do needs to be intentional based on that specific knowledge. And this means as well that for restorative justice, we also need to adapt our services based on that knowledge. Why do we need a trauma and shame sensitive approach to restorative justice? First, we know that trauma is widespread globally. Back in 2006, the World Health Organization conducted a large-scale study on how widespread trauma is in the world. And this was before the pandemic, before so many of the wars we have had ever since and that are ongoing. And even then, they realized that 70% of the world population will experience at least one traumatic event during their lifespan. And when I speak here of trauma, I refer to what Kirsty presented before. We see that there is an even higher prevalence in prisons. Studies show as well that, for example, among inmates who have committed serious crimes, up to 93% of them have as well experienced serious crimes and usually have not received any support. Also, in terms of post-traumatic symptoms, we see that the average is much higher than in the general population. We know as well that trauma caused by other people has a much higher risk of long-term impact. And when we look then at who are the victims who enter into restorative justice processes, usually these are people who have suffered from a crime committed by another person. So we are facing people who have this high risk of long-term impact. Trauma and shame deeply affect people's identity and the way they enter into relationships, they live relationships, they perceive relationships. And shame has been mentioned before in Kirsty's presentation. It's quite hard sometimes to understand how many victims suffer from a deep shame after having experienced a crime. Often they blame themselves for what has happened, although they have nothing to blame themselves for. They feel that they don't have the same worth anymore. They struggle with accepting their own dignity. also often they experience how others are blaming them, which is increasing their shame. The trauma itself may cause a lot of shame as well because of the taboo it's connected to, and there are so many other factors that make shame a major factor. We know as well that shame increases post-traumatic symptoms, makes recovery a lot more difficult, and that people who suffer from shame have a hard time as well to reach out and receive help. On the other hand, first, as I said, we know that many of the offenders also have experienced trauma themselves, so they may already bear this burden of shame through what they have been through. But as well, this shame then bears the risk of turning into violence. Nathanson and Gilligan, who are both very well-known forensic psychiatrists, they have studied this for a long time. And they define shame as one of the major risk factors for offending behavior, because shame can be so unbearable that it often is covered and hidden behind other emotions, and anger and rage is one of these possibilities. Then we also have our facilitators. When we consider that 70% of the world population will experience a traumatic event during their lifespan, the same is true for the facilitators. Plus, we know as well that 50% of helping professionals have the risk to also experience secondary trauma during their professional career. So it means that in restorative justice, if we want to be trauma-informed and shame-sensitive, we need to be so with all of the participants, including the facilitators. You saw the 5 R's mentioned before, and I'd like to adapt them to restorative justice and what it means there. So the first one is that we need to realize the pervasiveness and impact of trauma, recognize that both sides may bring trauma histories that influence their engagement and their outcomes. We need to be able as facilitators to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, to understand that often these are adaptive coping strategies, and adapt our process accordingly. So if we have people, for example, where we realize that they are very anxious, very fearful, or as well that they might erupt very quickly and get angry, or so many other symptoms, that we understand, okay, this may be one of these traumatic symptoms, and we need to be careful. We really need to adapt our services and be sensitive to this. We need to respond by integrating the knowledge that we have from neurobiology of trauma into all aspects of practice. This means from the moment we have an intake through the process of receiving consent from parties to participate, to the preparation, process design, follow-up. We really need to be trauma informed at all of these stages and take this knowledge into consideration. This means that our services need to be predictable. As we heard, for someone who has experienced trauma, they often live in a lot of fear. The world has become a dangerous place. They struggle to trust people. They don't feel safe anymore in so many situations. So we need to make sure that they really know what's awaiting them, what the next step is, what's going to happen. We need to be very transparent as well in our processes, in our communication, so that we do not add to that fear or anxiety. And we need to be able to support them to feel safe and respected throughout the process. We also need to resist re-traumatization by proactively designing processes that minimize triggers. This means that we're sensitive with our language, inclusive, that we maintain clear boundaries, that we are very clear as well. What can we offer? What can't we offer? That we offer choices wherever we can. Trauma takes away all of the control, all of the choice, all of the power from a person. Something happens to an individual that this person has no control over. All power is taken from them. And so it's very important that we really try to give back as much power and control as possible wherever we can, as well to allow participants to pause or withdraw from the process where needed, to come back to the process at the later stage, and as well to check with them what might trigger as well fear, anxiety, or whatever throughout the process, so that we can really be prepared and know how to support them. And what I really like about the Scottish system and the framework is its emphasis on relationships, which I feel that sometimes is left a bit out in other frameworks. To really know that relational safety is key in practice, to really put emphasis on empathy, responsiveness, being reliable, and to really put emphasis on rebuilding trust with people who have been harmed by others, who have experienced this broken trust and who may really have a hard time trusting again. This also then builds the basis for accountability, because it's so hard to be accountable for something I have done if I cannot trust the people who are accompanying me in the process. And if people feel safe in a relationship with the facilitators, it's also easier to engage more openly. So I really say the quality of relationships is often the most powerful catalyst to provide change. You heard about the 6 principles before: safety, trust, choice, all of these. And I'd like to show, based on 2 case studies, how these may apply to restorative justice. These are 2 true cases, one coming from a person, Hannah, who has participated as a victim, and Rob, who entered the process as an offender. So Hannah, she was an international student from Africa. She was very outgoing, very confident, very sociable. She really loved being with her friends, going out, and she suffered a late night robbery where she was pushed into a corner. She had no chance to escape, and she really froze in that moment. And from that moment on, she really had a hard time trusting people. The world became that unsafe place for her. She became anxious and withdrawn, and from that night on, she started experiencing panic attacks. Rob entered the process as an offender. And he is someone who suffered a lot of abuse and neglect during his childhood. He received no support whatsoever. He started using alcohol from a very young age. Again, it was a way to cope with his distress. It went largely unnoticed, no support whatsoever. And he then repeated the pattern of violence towards a friend during his adolescence. And so it was this friend who came to us and asked for a restorative process. We then got to know Rob, and we realized he suffered from a lot of shame, self-blame, and a lack of trust, and he had a really hard time entering into relationships. So in restorative justice, when we want to be trauma-informed, it's really important that we consider safety at multiple levels. Physical safety, to see what might be a safe environment for these people to engage in a process, as well in the preparation phase. What are meeting locations where they feel safe, where they feel that they really can enter into that process, where there is emotional, relational, and procedural safety. We cannot define safety ourselves. We need to identify with participants what feels safe for them. For some, it might be safe to enter into one of our offices and sit down and talk to us there. For others, they prefer to be outside, where they have this feeling that they can run away at any moment. We need to have very clear, predictable structures where they know what's coming. So for Hannah, it was really important to identify what it meant for her to feel safe, that we understood as well what potential triggers were for her panic attacks, and how we could support her in these moments, and from the start to co-design the process with her. For Rob, emotional safety was key, as his history of abuse and neglect meant that he had a hard time entering relationships. It always felt risky. So it was important to create this atmosphere where he felt listened to without judgment, where he also was able to open up about his own pain, his own past, and so that he could feel safe to explore both his own victimization, but as well the harm he had committed. As we heard, trust is one of the aspects that's really affected when someone has experienced trauma, and this grows gradually again. So we really need to be reliable, transparent. We need to honor our commitments, as I mentioned before, clearly explain boundaries as well in terms of confidentiality. What can stay confidential and where would we have to share things with other authorities or maybe other colleagues or other services. For Hannah, this required a very gentle, consistent approach, no pressure at all to discuss what she had been through. She needed very clear explanations, and we had to follow through on what had been agreed. There could be no changes, or it really would make her anxious. For Rob, as he experienced genuine interest in his story and that his pain was acknowledged as well without excusing his actions, it really was possible for him to open up and to really work through his own pain as well before getting into the harm he had caused. Trauma really erodes a person's sense of agency and autonomy. And as I had mentioned before, choice is so crucial, that we give them choice regarding timing, location, discussion topics, the pacing. Even the smallest choices can be crucial for people who have experienced trauma. And so sometimes for example, when we work in prison, it may be that we feel, oh, there's almost no choice. But even where the person wants to sit, or how they would like to be addressed, or how they want to address us, really to see where are even small choices we can give them and hand over some of that power. For Hannah, it was really important that she could counter that loss of control, that she could choose the venue, really feel involved in developing the structure as well of the dialogue then when we were planning for the actual encounter, that as facilitators we knew how we could recognize her signs of panic, what she expected from us in these moments. Rob, in the beginning, he really struggled to recognize his own needs. He was really focused on the needs of his victim. And so it was important as well to work on this, that he as well has the right to make choices throughout the process. And this was an important step as well in reclaiming his personal agency and self-worth. Collaboration is closely connected to what I have said before, that we recognize they are the experts in their own life experiences, that we include them in the decisions we make, that we balance the power, that we are ready as well to adjust processes to their needs. So it's important as well to always ask for their feedback, see if something has changed, if maybe their aims or their needs have changed, or what the end of the process might look like, and to readapt again. In Hannah's case, we really tried to include her in every stage of the preparation, and to really work as well through these moments of overwhelm, so that she could take an active role and be ready then as well in the moment where she would encounter the person who had harmed her. For Rob, it was important that he could acknowledge both his position as a victim and offender, to explore his own experiences, to help identify what he needed for his own process of healing, but then as well to take responsibility for his actions. Empowerment is closely related again to these previous principles. Empowerment restores voice, agency, and dignity. It builds on choice and collaboration. And I think one important aspect of empowerment is as well to recognize the strengths of the parties. What I often hear from victims is that they feel that they're only looked at as vulnerable and frail, and that they are not being seen as a person anymore who has strengths. And it's really important for them to realize, yes, I do have my strengths, I do have my resources, and that we can work with this. And as well, this reinforces steps towards self-determination. For Hannah, it was very important to rediscover her own confidence, her own agency, to recognize as well that her fear, her traumatic responses were absolutely normal. These were not personal failings. And this in the end helped her to really articulate very clearly towards her offender what has happened, how this had impacted her. And this again empowered her to say, and I had the strength to do this. I was able to face this person. And for Rob, again, it took this form of working on accountability and self-awareness, and see that there as well, he can make choices as well about his own life, about his own healing process, and that it doesn't need to go on the way it had been going on, that he can step out of this. We also need to consider that trauma is embedded into a cultural context. So we really need this cultural humility as facilitators to understand that culture also affects how people make meaning of what they have been through. There are also the aspects of inequality, of power imbalances, all of this, and that we as facilitators, we need to be as well curious to understand the background of the people we work with, where they come from. So for Hannah, for example, her coping strategies were quite different to our own coping strategies. They were deeply rooted in her cultural background. So it was important as well to learn from her what makes sense to her, what's meaningful for her, so that we could support her in this. And for Rob, it was as well to recognize how structural disadvantage, neglect, and substance misuse also shaped his own trauma and offending behavior, and to work with this. Now, I see time is running. I won't have much time to go into this in detail, but you'll have the presentation afterwards as well, I guess, in PDF. So one aspect that we should not forget is shame. As I mentioned before, how shame impacts the feeling of identity, dignity of both sides. And so to be really trauma-informed, we also need a shame-sensitive approach in restorative justice. We need to acknowledge shame, be able to notice subtle cues, know how to respond to this, avoid adding even more shame to the people we have in front of us, but as well create safe spaces where we can really address shame, how they suffer from it, to really enable this expression. I experience that often this is so important for parties, and would they appreciate as well that they finally can speak about these things that seem so unspeakable. Brené Brown, who's really an expert in this, she says people need to learn to recognize their own shame as well, how they express it, speak shame, that it really can get out, but as well to receive and give empathy, and to learn to be compassionate with themselves as well. So this is really an aspect we need to take into consideration when we work trauma-informed, because it affects all these individuals. Kirsty has addressed the need of trauma-informed organizations, and again, I won't have time to go into this in detail, but for me, it's really important. I think this is often an aspect that we neglect, that we forget that our practitioners, they are at risk of traumatic experiences as well, or of secondary trauma, and that as organizations, we really take this into considerations, that we build trauma-informed organizations where our facilitators as well are being supported in their work and in all they do, because they are as well the most important people that we have in these processes. So I was asked to briefly address as well, how did we go about to develop a trauma-informed approach in Switzerland? So for us, it was important that we would create a holistic service for those affected, especially by serious harm. So key aspects for us were, as the Council of Europe recommendation says, that we don't only offer one methodology, but diverse processes, so that really all those affected or interested have a chance to enter into restorative processes, and that it is open for all types of crime. So this called for a multi-tiered approach. And we went for three major areas. One is offering victim-offender dialogues, where the ones directly impacted by a crime can come together in direct or indirect ways to enter into this dialogue about what has happened, the impact it has had on their lives, and how to address it. Then we offer restorative dialogues in groups after serious harm. So there we have unrelated victims and offenders who come together after being individually prepared and as well in groups to share in 8 sessions of 2 hours their stories, the impact it has had on them, and they support each other. And we also have a re-entry or family circle program for especially long-term incarcerated individuals and their loved ones, because we know that often they are victims as well. So for us, it's important when people approach us to analyze what's their context, what are their needs, the possibilities and the risks, and then decide together what approach suits best their needs, their situation, and that we co-design the process with them. So it may be that they can enter into direct process. It may be that this is not possible, that they enter into a group. But whatever approach is used, that our work really intentionally is based on a trauma-informed standpoint, that we take trauma and shame into consideration, work with it, name it, in a very intentional and safe way. This means as well that we really give time and space for preparation, and that it is according to the participant space, and that we extend this approach as well to facilitators. So what makes the difference between trauma-informed and non-trauma-informed restorative justice? It means that we assume that trauma may be present in everyone involved, that our work is grounded in specific knowledge, that we intentionally adapt our practice by modifying processes, that we prioritize safety at every stage of the process with everyone involved, and that we're attentive to shame, triggers, and nervous system responses, knowing that these may be signs of trauma, and that we need to be very cautious and careful in working with these people, that we avoid re-traumatizing people by carefully pacing, giving choice, that we're really clear on consent, that people really enter these processes without any pressure from anywhere, and that we're flexible and adapt the processes at any point, that we have a strength-based approach and really try to empower the party so that they can take this process forward. It's not our process, it's their process. And it centers around relationships, connection, and empathy. And again, that we consider our facilitators. So restorative justice is not inherently trauma-informed. It requires specific knowledge and training. Trauma and shame do shape the engagement for all the participants, and we need to be aware of this and adapt the processes. But I'm sure that if we do so, a trauma-informed approach to restorative justice makes it safer and more effective. It allows for full and authentic engagement. It really helps participants to regain power and control, and it takes care of the well-being of facilitators and the teams. And so I'm really convinced that a trauma-informed and shame-sensitive approach to restorative justice can enhance its effectiveness and safety for everyone involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Claudia. So it's really fascinating, both your talks. Steve, I turn to you. If you want to, you have about 10 minutes to give a few thoughts, and then we'll turn to you all and can have a discussion, and our speakers can answer your questions. If you want to already put some in the chats, you're welcome to. You can also hold back and we can take them on later. Steve, please.
Thank you very much. Claudia, could I just ask you to stop sharing your slides? Is that okay?
Super, thank you.
Is it okay now? Sorry,
Yeah,
I thought I had closed everything.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Thanks so much for the opportunity to respond to these presentations, and particularly, thanks so much, Kirsty and Claudia, to responding to our invitation to speak today on what is a really important topic. And I think the presentations works really nicely together. In the preparation for today, when we met, Claudia explained that actually a lot of the knowledge underpinning the approach to trauma-informed practice and restorative justice came from Scotland. So it was really nice to see that what we have here is really really international, you know, sharing of knowledge going from Scotland to Switzerland back again. So that's great. All I'm going to do is just pick up on a few points from each of the speakers that I thought were particularly noteworthy, if you like, and offer a few reflections and end actually with a couple of questions that occurred to me as well. So beginning with Kirsty's presentation, I think it's really important to see the recognition of the impact of trauma on people in justice contexts and the specific measures that have been put in place in Scotland to increase the understanding of trauma amongst the workforce and translate that into practice. And this is really quite widespread, as Kirsty was saying, you know, so it includes social workers and a range of other practitioners. And I was also interested to hear that included the judiciary as well, because I'm interested in how that might translate into, you know, other criminal justice contexts too. There was a really helpful distinction between different ways of understanding stress: positive stress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress. And I wondered, you know, where could restorative justice processes and experiences be understood, you know, in this kind of continuum? Could we think of it, or is it experienced, for example, as positive stress to actually take part in a restorative justice process? Not necessarily easy, but with support could be handled in a way that leads to positive outcomes for people. I thought it was really important to take into account the impact of post-traumatic stress. So things like heightened sense of threat, re-experiencing the events, avoidance, and also those complex post-traumatic stress reactions like difficulties managing emotions, problems sustaining safe and trusting relationships, negative beliefs about the self, and shame. And so that when we start to think about, well, what sort of behaviours might be exhibited by people when restorative justice practitioners are engaging with them, that it could include things that were mentioned like risky behaviour, avoiding addressing emotions, drug and alcohol misuse. So if people, for example, are under the influence in drugs of alcohol as a way of coping with trauma, what kinds of barriers or challenges does that bring up? And also, what about if people are, you know, avoiding dealing with difficult emotions, even if they wish to? So that actually someone might, for example, say that they wish to engage in restorative justice, but there might be a range of things they're doing that actually seem to be avoiding actually going through with the process. How do we understand that as a kind of a trauma response potentially and deal with that? One thing I thought was really interesting was to look at the trauma-informed principles that Kirsty mentioned. So choice, empowerment, safety, trust, and collaboration. And I was just thinking how they could be considered in relation to restorative justice. So if you think about choice, people have the choice as to whether to take part in restorative justice and in what ways. Empowerment, being able to have voice and directly participate in justice processes in ways that they want. Safety is always key to restorative justice, and it's about ensuring that processes are safe for everyone. Trust. So in my view, criminal harm damages trust. It damages trust between individuals, but it also can damage trust between individuals and society or communities. So restorative justice can offer ways to try and help rebuild trust between people, and perhaps for people to feel more trusting about the areas that they live in, for example. Collaboration. Restorative justice practitioners collaborate with people in restorative justice processes, and also restorative justice facilitates people to collaborate with each other to address harm. Thinking about trauma-skilled practice, what does it do? It offers an opportunity for people to experience more positive relationships than they've experienced before. That was something that Kirsty was talking about. And I guess in restorative justice, this means potentially replacing harmful relationships and experiences with more positive relationships and experiences that actually address harm and lead to people ideally being able to have more fulfilling lives, and thinking about the harmful experience that people, you know, will have had that might lead them to engaging with restorative justice, then experiencing actually a more positive engagement with someone as a way of addressing that harm. How does that actually help to address those experiences of harmful relationships? I thought Kirsty mentioned this, and then this was really clear in Claudia's presentation too, about the need to consider issues of trauma in relation to everyone. For restorative justice, that means the person harmed, the person responsible for the harm, family members, support people, and as Claudia said, restorative justice facilitators as well, because people can be affected by the trauma of criminal harm in various ways, but also there can be trauma that they may have experienced from unrelated experiences too that need to be taken into consideration. We can't make assumptions about what people may or may not have experienced. So if there's, for example, a family member or a support person in a process, we need to consider that they may have needs related to trauma as well. So that was some of my kind of responses mainly to Kirsty's presentation, and taking it on to Claudia's. I thought there was a range of really important points there that were being made. And one of the things she started with was highlighting that it's painful for people harmed by crime to realize that they tend not to have a voice in criminal justice processes. And I guess, an important point for me is how often criminal justice processes actually create further trauma or compound trauma. So what does that mean when we try and think of practices that are actually taking into account trauma and trying to act in ways that address and not address trauma rather than compound it? She talked about the importance of co-constructing processes that meet people's needs, and I thought there were some really helpful, examples about methods of communication that enable people to enter into dialogue safely. And she talked about restorative justice and trauma-informed practice having similar values but not being the same approach. And I think that's really important, because we can't assume, for example, that just because you're practicing restorative justice, that means you also have an in-depth understanding of what trauma is and are able to practice in a way that actually addresses that. And I think thinking across both what Claudia was talking about and Kirsty, we can think about actually this requires an in-depth understanding of trauma and what trauma-informed and trauma-skilled practice actually involves. Again, thinking about the criminal justice context, well, Claudia talked about trauma being widespread globally, but also elevated in prison. So we need to think about, again, both the kind of the characteristics of people who might engage in restorative justice and the trauma that they might have experienced, but how actually the criminal justice processes can further compound that. So, for example, if you're engaging someone who's in prison, coming out of prison in a restorative justice process, how and to what extent is it really dealing with the trauma of that imprisonment as well? I thought the discussion of shame and blame was really important because, as Claudia mentioned, people harmed by crime can often experience deep shame and blame themselves and have low self-worth. And so for me, restorative justice has some potential to deal with shame. And one of the ways I think about this, and it's connected to, many of you may be familiar with Braithwaite's theory of reintegrative shaming, which was one of the kind of key theories around restorative justice. Part of this is about treating or separating the person from the behavior. So it's often seeing that the person is good and is inherently good and has good potential, even if certain behaviors were bad or harmful or negative. And so that this is one way of trying to deal with shame, is to say that you actually are a good person, you can be good, even though we don't agree with some of the behavior that you've exhibited here. By engaging in restorative justice, you can actually try and overcome some of that blame or shame and work towards a more positive future. So there is, I think, some potential there, but it has to be, as Claudia was saying, dealt with in a sensitive and careful way. I thought the examples of Hannah and Rob were really valuable for getting into, what their needs are, how people's needs are different, and what it means to practice in these trauma-informed ways in relation to people, and things like clear communication, preparation, building trust through acknowledging harm are all really important points and well made. One of the things I was picking up is how trauma erodes people's feelings of agency and autonomy. And so restorative justice, one of the things I think it does is it offers choices to people. As Claudia said, it signals respect for people to actually enable people to make those choices and can help them to build a sense of control. So while on one hand, people might think, well, if someone has experienced trauma, then actually, putting them in a situation where they might engage with the person who caused this harm could be problematic, and you might want to protect people from that. But actually, what I was taking from this is by enabling people choice and autonomy and agency, you're actually helping people to deal with and overcome aspects of trauma. So actually being overprotective could actually work against, the potential to actually overcome trauma. And so for me here, empowerment is about the opportunity to take steps to meet with a person who harmed you, in the case of someone who's been harmed by crime, but also for someone who's committed criminal harm, to have the opportunity to take responsibility for their behaviour and their situation in a way that's supported, which allows the potential to change their situation, to move towards something that's more positive. And this can actually be a way of coping and moving on from trauma. So I just wanted to finish my comments with a couple of questions that I was reflecting on. The first one was really, if we think that, how criminal justice processes can compound trauma rather than help people to overcome them, then what else needs to change in the wider processes to better respond to trauma? And another question I had was, what other practices and resources are needed to help enable people to engage with restorative justice processes where trauma is present? So, for example, do we need to think kind of more broadly than the restorative justice kind of process itself, to think about what other support might people require, such as specialist psychological services in some cases, or just other things that might even be less formal, but actually necessary to help someone to manage the impact of trauma, to really enable them to engage in a restorative justice process. That's my comments and reflections. Thanks again for your presentations. I found them really, really interesting and stimulating, and I hope the reflections were useful.
Thank you so much, Steve. Certainly useful. Okay, so we have now about half an hour for some discussion and questions. You are welcome to write your questions in the chat and I can relate them. If you prefer talking, you please just raise your hand, the electronic hand there, and I'll give you the floor. If you would probably just introduce yourself and just say where you're from and what field you work in, that would be useful. I maybe turn first to Claudia and Kirsty if you want to respond to Steve's questions. Is that all right?
Kirsty, you can go first.
You're muted.
I'm not doing well with the technology at all today. I'm going to ask Steve if he can pop his questions in the chat, if that's okay. Yeah, I think it'd be helpful just to reflect. I think the first one related to justice systems, but I'm not just, apologies. I didn't write it down quickly enough.
That's fine. I'll pop them in the chat. And the first one was probably more directed to Kirsty, and the second one probably more to Claudia. So I'll put that in the chat for you now.
Well, I really want to answer the second one, Steve. But anyway, I'll give a bash to the first one. I'm kidding. Excuse me. I think there's a lot of work underway led by the Scottish Government Victims and Witnesses unit across justice systems at the moment. It's led by Dr. Caroline Bruce. So there's an extensive amount of work taking place. And I gave an example earlier of training for the judiciary, and I think that was it was an easy example. It was a very, very important example, I think, in terms of where Scotland has progressed to. So a real recognition that processes around courts, processes around prosecution, processes in terms of kind of supporting victims and witnesses need to be adapted, and that is in the context of understanding the impact that these processes at court and before court can have. So I think in terms of what else needs to change in the wider process, a lot of that work is underway within the system. Crown Office are significantly engaged with work, as are the judiciary and Police Scotland. So I think arguably in Scotland, I'm not saying that we have this fix, because we most certainly don't, but what we've got is a national commitment to this work, and we've got kind of extensive pieces of work taking place across a whole range of different justice organisations and justice systems, with a recognition that where we are now is not where we want to be. I don't know if that's too general for you, Steve, but I think that it's really it was really delightful recently just to hear. I was part of an event with Caroline and colleagues, and just to hear some of the kind of individual reflections from the judiciary and from Crown Office, etc., in relation to where they are on their journey. And obviously the publication of the Victims and Witnesses Framework has offered them something against which they can benchmark themselves and work towards to strive to do better.
That's, yeah, really helpful. Great to see that work around victims and witnesses too. I guess part of my question is also about for those who have committed criminal offending on that side, and I wonder if that's even a bit more challenging, if you like, in terms of changes to processes.
I'm happy to come in that from a justice social work perspective. So I think that clearly things are set up within our systems that are unhelpful, that don't offer choice and collaboration, trust, empowerment and safety, and the adaptation to those systems, particularly in systems of compulsion, statutory supervision, and where risk management is a primary focus, understandably and correctly so. There's a lot of adaptation required. I think one of the key things that I hear back from those who are engaged in this work day to day is that this isn't a polarised conversation, that it's really important that we recognise that everybody within the system who's been harmed will benefit from a trauma-informed approach across systems, policies and practice. So thinking, for example, how we apply national outcomes and standards within a criminal justice context is really crucial when we think about choice, collaboration and relationship-based practice. And equally, if we're thinking about those who've caused harm to others who might be engaged in community payback orders or other statutory work, really just thinking about the importance of rehabilitation and engagement with people, and how some of these barriers mean that we won't make significant change, we won't build relationships with people if we don't adapt our practice. So we're much less likely to impact on risk reduction if we're not able to collaborate with people and use these principles in our practice. So those are some general reflections, and I think that the kind of practice is shifting, and here's our lovely Kira who will talk to us about this from the real world. But thanks for that.
Do you mind if I come in, Steve? Do you know, all it is I really think that our practice has shifted, and it's shifted so much even in the past kind of 10 years, but I think there needs to be a societal shift before the idea of treating somebody who has caused harm in a trauma-informed way will be accepted. We do that. We treat people that have caused harm to others in as trauma-informed a way as we possibly can, I think. But actually, you know, when you see, you know, stories in the media, soft justice, you know, all that kind of stuff, I think there needs to be a real change outside of, when we are all preaching to the converted here. Everybody in this room believes in trauma-informed practice, believes in the power of restorative justice, but that we're so tiny compared to the rest of the population. I think that's where the challenge lies. The challenge lies in, you know, convincing people that pointing fingers and being mean is not how you rehabilitate people. I could talk about this for days. I'm going to stop there while there's a natural pause in my sentence. You're laughing, Steve, because you know what I'm like.
Thanks, Kira.
Thank you. Claudia, did you want to come in to Steve's question?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think one important aspect is that in restorative justice, we don't think we're the experts for everything. We need to collaborate with people. We need to collaborate with therapists and other services. Many of the requests we get for direct victim offender dialogues are in cases of sexual violence. And for us, it's extremely important to see where the person's at, what kind of support does the victim already have, or as well, maybe the offender. Do they have therapists that are working with them? What about the social support in general? And that we try to include these people as well within the preparation process, or as well, to make sure, for example, if we see that someone has no support whatsoever, first of all, well, most of them come through victim services, but if they haven't come through victim services, to already make that link. And then as well, to let them know about programs that exist, for example, for victims of sexual harm, where they have groups that come together and talk about it. So I really think it's about working in network. and as well to directing them to other services, collaborating with them. And one thing we often do as well is that we ask when they have a therapist, for example, accompanying them, if they'd like us to meet together with their therapist, so that we understand as well where they come from in terms as well of the therapeutic approach, that the therapists understand how we are working with them in restorative justice, that they can make us aware as well of risk factors and things like this, so that there's really close collaboration. Or we have as well cases where the therapists then take part in the victim-offender dialogue and are there to support their parties. They know they're not there to intervene, but they are there just to be present and be able as well to support their clients afterwards. So I think for me, this is a major aspect, that we don't work in isolation. As well, sometimes we have victims who come to us 2 weeks or a month or so after a rape, and then we often realize they might want to go into restorative process immediately, but we realize that they are still very traumatized. There is much work that needs to be done prior to engaging with the other party. That doesn't mean that we need to withdraw. I mean, preparation processes can be quite long, but again, to connect them with other services and just take it slowly and go step by step. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
It did answer my question very well. Thanks so much, Claudia.
So the floor is open for anyone who would have some questions. I saw that Pamela Morrison, you put some information in the chat, and I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit more about this, about what the fusion means. No. Jonathan, you've put a very long message there. Maybe you want to talk to it?
Sorry, I was typing it away and it was getting longer and longer. I put it in the box as well. Yeah, first off, look, I mean, thanks so much to everybody. That was so useful, you know, and so interesting, both in terms of the understanding of trauma and how it impacts on people, and I guess how to respond to that. But then also, you know, also in the examples and thinking about, you know, what that means, I guess, perhaps more broadly for practice. And I mean, my question was sort of around those concepts and principles. And I think we often think about, or I often perhaps think about trauma, you know, in terms of those immediate harms that people face, you know, when there's been a crime or you know, or something terrible's happened. But actually there are a lot of, you know, often very significant underlying things that many of us struggle with, and that many people struggle with more than others, such as, you know, the example there in terms of racism, talking to some colleagues in the US, you know, and just how pervasive racism can be, and how everyday those events are, and actually bringing those really traumatic things that are institutionalized to meetings, and they're not often talked about, they're not often spoken about, you know, misogyny, all that horrible on Andrew Tate online stuff, all that horrible stuff, you know, that these things cause real everyday trauma. And actually, if we think about some of those broader social inequalities and harms, can we use that language and understanding of trauma to help us think about all those different challenges people bring into a meeting? I've made that longer. Not sure in explaining it. I'm sorry about that, but I hope that makes sense. And look, thanks again so much for everybody's time.
Do either Claudia or Kirsty or both want to respond to this?
I mean, I'm happy to just comment. Generally, I suppose I think using the language of trauma, we need to think about it really carefully and sensitively. And absolutely, there will, you know, there's research and evidence directly correlating people's experiences of direct and indirect racism and with different impacts and also different outcomes. So we know that this is absolutely real and relevant for people in terms of our cultural approach. And I think Claudia very kindly and carefully spoke earlier about us not making too many assumptions about the cultural kind of differences and nuances that we need to really give space for in these conversations to make sure that we don't see ourselves as experts in this area. So I suppose I'm quite cautious about the use of psychological trauma language, and I think we just need to be very thoughtful and very considered and reflective about it. Because often, I think there was an example earlier about the kind of trauma that might be caused by imprisonment. Trauma is associated with quite high levels of toxic stress. And it's likely that some people who've experienced imprisonment may also experience some incidences in prison as psychologically traumatic. But there's quite a distinct difference there. So I think we just need to kind of keep having these conversations and kind of keep being thoughtful about it. And if I've got the floor, I'm going to take the opportunity somewhat cheekily to go back to the kind of question that was asked earlier about additional resources that might be needed to help engage people where trauma is present. And I know that Stevie raised that specifically in relation to restorative justice, but if I could just take that wider approach, a lot of what we've talked about today sits at the trauma-informed and the trauma-skilled level, and Claudia quite rightly talked about trauma specialists and those who are delivering psychological therapies and treatment that are essential, but somewhere in amongst that is trauma-enhanced practice, and that's really, I think, what is part of the nub of the situation that we're in at the moment in terms of the gap between where we are and our aspiration about where we want to get to. So the kinds of safety and stabilisation interventions and approaches that we would anticipate primarily in this field sits with restorative justice practitioners is absolutely crucial, because that's about how we respond. Applying the principles is something that we would anticipate people would do when they're answering the phone, people would do when they're opening the door, people would do when they're writing a letter. Applying the principles is across all of the system. But actually trauma-enhanced practices, that evidence-based safety and stabilisation approaches. And what's particularly, I suppose, relevant for this conversation is what we're hearing from the front line at the moment. So hearing from workforce that getting trained in trauma-enhanced level practice is distinctly different. It brings something additional and something new. It's not what people were doing already, and it's very skills focused. So helping people, as Claudia quite rightly mentioned earlier, understand what's happened to them. We talked a bit about normalising, so that kind of psychoeducation work, really getting people to talk with people in front of them about post-traumatic stress and complex post-traumatic stress in language that normalises, reduces shame, and really helps them to understand models of PTSD. That's kind of, I suppose, a big gap for us at the moment, and it's something that we're working towards. And I think that it's something that applies equally within restorative justice. I would imagine if we mapped everybody's jobs over to the knowledge and skills framework, as it does within other justice in practice areas.
Okay. Claudia, did you want to come in?
No, thank you. I think Kirsty answered everything.
Okay. I saw Pamela Morrison came back on, so I don't know. Pamela, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Sorry.
Sorry for putting you on the spot. I just saw some of your colleagues did answer my question, but to come back a bit about what you meant by fusion of trauma-informed and restorative justice principles. So if you want to add something to what your colleagues said, that would be great.
Yeah, it was really just as soon as Steve started speaking about it, it made me think exactly of the kind of fusion that was done, and I'm glad it's kind of confirmed that it was within that document, because I thought I should have seen it somewhere. But yeah, I guess that just really, for me, kind of pulls those together and kind of highlights where there's so many crossovers and so many sort of learning that we can take from the kind of trauma-informed work and the kind of the range of work that's happening in that field. So yeah, I think as Pam shared it, and then I think Hannah as well from a blog there. So hopefully that can be helpful as well.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions or comments from the audience? I was wondering, since I saw that both Claire Aldington and Gail Cochrane are here, if they would speak from their practice experience as well, a little bit about trauma-informed practices and restorative justice.
Do you want to speak? I can't see Claire. I don't think that I have much to add that hasn't been said by Claudia and Kirsty, and it's brilliant to have them both here. So it's I think they're two of the best people to talk about this, if I'm honest. You know, it's in everything that we do in restorative justice. I was trained or was aware of the trauma-informed framework just before I got involved in restorative justice, and wouldn't shut up about the crossovers when I was being trained in restorative justice. So I think, you know, ultimately, if we're going to practice restorative justice properly and responsibly, then it has to be trauma-informed. That doesn't mean that everybody does it in a trauma-informed way, but it should be. And I think it is, as everybody said, it's got to be from the start. It's got to be how you respond to your first inquiry, and the tiny little details, and that just predictability and reliability that has been spoken about already. Yeah, I think everything really positive, everything that can be said about it has been said, but we have you know, we get great when we do speak to people, when we do follow up, you know, we do get feedback that it has been trauma-informed. People really feel, they're not saying it's trauma-informed, but the feedback that we get, the words that they use fit with the principles and with the principles of restorative justice. Hope that's okay.
Yeah, no, thank you. Sorry for putting you on the spot. I just thought
No, I quickly want to come in because Gail, speaking of the experts, I mean, Gail really is an expert, and so many things I've learned from training with you as well, because we have been co-teaching as well trauma-informed practice and restorative justice. So I'd say thank you, Gail, as well, from all I've learned from you when we were working together.
Thank you.
She's one of the big experts in this field.
Thank you.
Steve, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, thanks. I guess it's something I just wanted to share in terms of what I've been thinking about this conversation, and it's based actually on something an experienced practitioner, restorative justice practitioner, said to me. Is when someone who'd been harmed by crime was thinking about whether, for example, they wanted to meet the person who had met them, and he said it's the idea that they might not want to do that. Part of the avoidance is the idea that if there was this kind of, the fire was out there, if you reach out, you burn your hand. The fire is in the person who you potentially meet. But he said, in fact, the fire is in here. And there's something to do with how trauma operates kind of psychologically and within people in relation to someone else that someone thinks about. And it also connects to what some of the research that yourself, Estelle, and Marie Keenan have done around survivors of gender-based violence. That idea of the memory of the person who had harmed them, and actually how that can change through the process of restorative justice. The kind of thing that someone said, you know, originally I thought they were a monster, but now I see they're just a young man. And just how that changes. And so I guess I was just interested to hear if anyone, perhaps Claudia, you know, had something to say actually about the role of kind of memory and those psychological processes, and how restorative justice intersects with those in the way that allows people to deal with and recover from trauma.
Yeah, so what we know from the neurobiology of trauma, as you say, trauma really affects the memory as well. And the problem we have there, Kirsty made reference to it as well, are these flashbacks, these memories coming back. And we know it's because trauma doesn't store memories the same way after a traumatic event as it would during a regular day. For example, let's say today, I will remember in the evening what I did in the morning, at lunchtime, and in the evening, and I know the day is over, it's done. But with trauma, it really has there is a big difficulty that it can't store the memories in a chronological order. So there are lots of images, sensory input, and other things that are stored in different parts of the brain. but it's not a chronological story. It's not a narrative. So it means these memories can pop up at any moment, and that's what causes the flashbacks. So what we know is that when a person can start to create the narrative of what has happened, that's the moment where flashbacks can be reduced as well, because during the time that a person still feels is still suffering a lot from the traumatic event, it's like the trauma has no beginning and no end. It's ongoing. And when we work on that narrative and people start to see, okay, that's what happened in the beginning, then this happened, and there's an end to it, that's when it helps as well that these flashbacks can be reduced and the person realizes the trauma is not ongoing, it's finished. And what I think in the restorative process, what's really helpful is first we do work with that narrative, but we don't push people like to share a full story. But since preparation is ongoing, so already what happens there when they start sharing bits and pieces of what they have gone through, that helps them as well in that narrative process. But then I'd say as well, in that dialogue that they may have with the person who has caused the harm, they get as well more input about what has happened. And so this can help to fill gaps as well that they have. And so I'd say that narrative approach really can help in restorative justice, that the person realizes it's over, it's finished. And yes, this helps to reduce post-traumatic symptoms as well.
Thanks so much, Claudia. And I think that also really helps to explain why asking questions and getting answers is so valuable to people in a restorative justice process. Thank you.
Okay, we still have a little bit of time if anybody else has a question. Nope. I think then, yep, Kirsty, do you want to come in?
I'm going to take the opportunity to learn from our international experts. I'm interested in some of the descriptions that we've had about the approaches, which professionals are undertaking the assessment and what kind of approaches are used to ensure that safety. So you gave an example earlier, Claudia, of somebody who might be encouraged to not go straight into a restorative conversation because of the elevated current impact, and I'm just interested in kind of systems and processes around that, because it sounds to me like there are specialists involved. And again, that second example that you gave there about processing trauma memories, presumably through trauma specialists that are working around and within the system.
So your question is how we deal with that?
Say again.
So your question is how we deal with that when someone's not ready yet and all of this. Yeah. So I can use a case that we've had, which was a case where the person came to us through victim services only 2 weeks after the rape. So it was a victim who had been through traumatic experiences before, and she somehow put this pressure on her because it had been sexual violence. She now needed to be the perfect victim and go through everything in the way that's supposed to go. We realized later that she identified as someone who has caused harm before. So she thought, I have no rights, I have no needs, no, I just have to do what's expected from a victim to be done. And this is not going through a criminal justice process. This is going through a restorative process and then go on with my life. And so for us, a key moment was in one of the first conversations to check with her, what are your needs? What do you really need? What, not only why would you like this restorative process, but as well, what are your needs? What can it address? And we realized she didn't even know what her needs were at that moment. She just felt, I have to do this and go for it as quickly as possible. So in these cases, it was really important to make sure that she has, as you say, psychological support by someone who really understands about trauma. We felt as well that for her it was important to share with others about her experiences, to hear as well how others deal with their own experiences. And there is quite a good program where victims of sexual violence come together to share, like in a circle process. So this was something that was very helpful to her. And then it was really just making sure that we go slowly with her and that she's accompanied by trauma professionals on the side, and that we communicate with them as well. And actually, already the moment that she realized, I don't even know what my needs are, this is a moment where she started to cry, and where she realized, although I have been a victim, I don't really know what I need right now. And shame was a major issue as well. Shame is something that we can work with. So a lot of the work we did for her for quite a while was around the shame she felt as having been someone who had caused harm before, the shame as a victim as well. But it's really this collaborative working with other professionals. And you had a second question as well, Kirsty. I'm sorry, I forgot.
No, I think you've just answered it. That was really helpful, Claudia. I think what it's done is emphasised the importance of taking the time with suitably trained and qualified professionals who all work together to ensure the assessment's right before proceeding, and also the necessity, by the sounds of it, in your system whereby you would always have access to trauma specialists, and that work may take time. So that was really helpful. So thank you for that.
Okay. Last chance for a small question. Otherwise, I'll just conclude for today. Thank you so much to our two speakers, Claudia and Kirsty, and of course to Steve for his response. Thank you to all our participants for coming along today, and to my two co-chairs for nice collaboration since a long time. If you have any ideas for future webinars that would be useful for us here in Scotland, but broader as well, you're very welcome to let us know. The slides and the recordings will be sent out to all today's participants, all those registered. So we were about 90 people registered, so all of these will receive it. And then in future, the recording will also normally be available on the Forum RJ Scotland website, which the address I have put in the chat earlier. So I wish you all a very good afternoon, and thank you very much for attending, and see you soon. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.